I want to welcome you to our program today. We have a very special guest. His name is Cecil Murphey, but he likes to be referred to being called Cease. And so, Cease, good to have you with us today.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, and I must say that Cease is an author. He's authored books that, well, are very popular, well known. One of the books that he has written is entitled 90 Minutes in Heaven. It's a story about a pastor, Don Piper, who was in a terrible car accident. He died he was declared dead for 90 minutes, and he's a man who went to be with the Lord in heaven, but then the Lord brought him back. And so we have this book, plus there are other books, such as A Rebel with a Cause. That's a book about Franklin Graham. And then also Gifted Hands, a book about Ben Carson, a neurosurgeon, and also he was a political candidate running for the President of the United States. But altogether, Cease has written 137 books. And so, Cease, I just 137 books. Now that's a lot. That's like a whole big library in itself. You've written a library.
Something like that.
Yeah, so, well, anyway, like this book, for instance, has sold 90 Minutes in Heaven, has sold over 8 million copies. And
just in English.
Just in English. And so when I think about that, that's pretty successful as a writer.
Yes. And I get royalties on it, so yes.
And you get royalties on it, so that's always nice, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you can make a living doing what you love to do. Well, how long have you been writing books?
Well, I was a pastor, and I started writing. I was a pastor for 14 years, and I started writing during that period of time, and everything was selling. Not everything, but I had a few rejections, but I was just selling. And in my early days, what I'd do is I'd write a sermon, prepare a sermon, which I never actually followed, but I'd have a sermon, then I'd turn that into a manuscript. And so my first book's based on a series of sermons I did. But in 1984, I had an identity crisis. I had to decide if I was a preacher who wrote or a writer who preached.
Okay.
And I decided I was first a writer. And so 32 years ago, I left the pastorate and been writing since.
Yeah, to be able to, so when you think about your writing, some of the books that I just mentioned here would be, more of a biographical nature where you're writing about someone. Is that kind of the nature of a lot of your books?
Yeah, actually, they're what we call autobiography. It's first person. I try to get inside their head. Mm-hmm. For instance, the first book I did was the singer B.J. Thomas, Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head.
Yes.
That was way back in like 1980, 1982. I've done a couple of sports figures. I don't know if you know who Sean Alexander is. He was a running back for the Seattle Seahawks.
Yes.
So, so I try to tell their story. Look, these are people who are gifted in many ways, but they're not gifted writers. Mm-hmm. So they come to people like me to tell their story. Just take it as a given. Any actor, athlete, politician, anybody who's really good at what they do, they probably don't write their own material. It's just a given.
And so another term for that would be a ghostwriter, where
That's
basically
right.
This is an autobiography, or
it is,
at least
yes.
a story about Don Piper, but you're the one who wrote it.
Yeah, and if you notice here, Don Piper's name is in very large letters, and mine you almost have to squint to see it, which is okay. I'm all right with that because it's there. And that now they're calling us collaborators because my name's on it. Before I did a number of books like Rebel with the Cause where my name is not on the book. Publishers just didn't put the ghostwriters' names on. That's why we were called ghostwriters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've read a lot of autobiographies, but then there's also some mention of, the person who, in a sense, wrote the book, through the person.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you look at somebody like Sean Alexander. I do, I'm a sports person. I enjoy watching sports. And I remember, he was quite a running back for the Seattle Seahawks. And also, he was the one who sang Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head.
B.J. Thomas.
B.J. Thomas. Yeah, so these are people that people know.
Oh, sure, sure.
Yeah, familiar names.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we like to hear their stories, but now we can appreciate the person for whom, takes the material and is able to write the material. And so now, so as far as like Don Piper now, this is a book about, well, he's a pastor. He was in a terrible car accident. He died for, 90 minutes.
Oh, well, more than that. We know at least 90 minutes.
At least 90 minutes. And then a fellow pastor happened to come upon the scene and just felt so inspired to pray for Don, even though, the police and the medics all said, well, there's no use and you don't even want to go to the scene.
In fact, they said to him, he's dead and he's been that way a long time. And we have signatures of 4 EMTs that he had no vital signs. So it wasn't just a near death. I do believe Don died.
Yeah, it sounds like he was dead.
Yes.
And then this pastor crawls into the car, begins to pray over Don. And I think it's special. What a Friend We Have in Jesus was the hymn that all of a sudden he started singing, and Don started singing the song, and it's just like, hey, you need to come back here and help this guy. And it's quite a story about his time in heaven, saying that he was in heaven and the things that he experienced, kind of described beyond, what really, it's beyond kind of human comprehension, but meeting people that he had known before who had died, and, the sounds, the music, the praise, but then also just his convalescence, his time in the hospital.
He had 34 surgeries.
34 surgeries, yeah. His time in the hospital, the pain, and the convalescence, his rehabilitation. It's quite a story. But
Yeah.
how did you, so how did Don approach you, or did you hear about this story that you were interested, or how did the two of you kind of get married in this project?
Okay, let me backtrack. First one I did was B.J. Thomas, only because I sent a book that I wrote to a Christian publisher in New York, and he didn't like the book, but he said, I think you understand people, I'd like you to become a ghostwriter for us. So I said, sure, why not? So he sent me to B.J. Thomas, and then I did Chick-fil-A, and there's an ultra-marathon runner named Stan Cottrell, so I was doing all those. But I wasn't sure this is what God really wanted me to do. So here's what I said. Okay, God, I am never going to ask anybody if I can do their book. If you want me to write other people's stories, you send them to me. Mm-hmm. And 30-some years, 32 years, I've never asked anybody. So I was teaching at a conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 2003. Don Piper came up to me and he said, I asked people about helping me write my book, and I keep getting your name, so I'd like you to write my book. And he told me a little bit, and I said, no, Don, it's a nice story, but I'm not interested in writing a near-death experience. And Don said, I really died. And I thought, yeah, I'll bet you did. I mean, I really was skeptical, honestly. Mm-hmm. And so, but I liked Don. We just had this wonderful time together. And finally, I said, okay, I will pray about it. And he later told me he didn't know if I really meant that, but I did. So we corresponded by email. Finally, after 3 or 4 months, he said, Cecil, there's one thing you don't get. If I had not been dead, if my heart had continued beating all that time, I would have bled to death. Second, the brain can only be deprived of oxygen about 4 minutes before you're pretty well gone, 6 minutes beyond resuscitation. And it's like, oh, yeah, I get it. So I said, let's do the book.
Mm-hmm. And so that's where it all started. And so, well, what a powerful story. I know a lot of people who've read this book. And like I say, 8 million people, over 8 million copies sold just in English. And so when you think about just in English, that means that it's been written in other languages as well.
I've lost track. The last I heard was 29, but it's probably in the 30s now in foreign languages, including Russian, Finnish, Chinese, you name it.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, that's intriguing. I mean, a lot of people, as we think about, what is written in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, that God has placed eternity in our hearts, so that everybody, has this question or this desire for for something beyond. Is there something beyond this life? And as Christian people, we certainly will live with that hope of the resurrection and life to come, through Jesus' resurrection. But I can see where this certainly is an interesting, topic of being able to hear of somebody who has died. I mean, he was declared dead and then goes to heaven and comes back and tells about it. I mean, I can see where this is a message that the world wants to hear.
Yeah, and believe it or not, it was on the bestseller list for many years, many months. And what we discovered is there were more people in the general market, meaning outside the Christian market, who were buying it more than the Christians.
Yeah, just that interested in knowing, because I think everybody would love to know that there is eternal life and that they would want to be there.
That's right.
But we live with our human nature and with our sin, and so a lot of doubts can creep into our minds about all of that. And so this book I felt was, one that I think can really at least get people thinking about that. And of course, then we grow in our faith to just trust in God's word to say, well, there's eternal life because our Lord has told us so.
Right.
And that's all and then the Holy Spirit takes over to build that up. Build up our faith to trust and believe. Well, now, okay, so I brought this book, but I know another book that was, very popular, and you can tell us how many copies have sold of that if you can tell us, but Rebel Without a Cause. This would be an autobiography of Franklin Graham.
Rebel with a Cause.
Rebel with a Cause. What did I say? Rebel without a cause.
That was the movie of something.
Yeah, Rebel with a Cause.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about sometimes maybe what people can refer. Yeah. So this would be just a different Rebel without a cause. This would be Rebel with a Cause. It's always good to have a cause, right? Rather than be, okay, thank you for that. But Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham, a person who, many of us know about and hear about, a powerful speaker, a powerful ministry. We always hear about Billy Graham, but now his son, who, certainly went through a time of rebelliousness, but then, repented. And what a powerful ministry that Franklin Graham has had. So here, how many books? A Rebel with a Cause. How many?
I don't know.
Do you have any idea how many of those have sold?
No, all I can tell you is the deal was a little different. I don't get royalties on it, so therefore I never would find out. But see, because they gave me a flat fee, and then they were selling it through the Billy Graham ministry, and I know other than the book Angels, the Billy Graham.
Yes.
This was the second bestseller.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
So that's all I know.
I imagine you found him to be a very interesting person.
Oh, yeah, all the Grahams are interesting. So.
All of them are interesting, right? Yeah, I imagine.
Well, everybody's interesting, period. So.
Yeah. Oh, very good. But now, with the presidential race going on and, all the candidates that were initially in the debates, I think about Ben Carson. He as being a Republican candidate for President of the United States. A person that I think we all came to enjoy. He was a neurosurgeon, and now running for president. I think we all could see that here's a man with a very loving heart and a care for people.
And integrity.
A man of high integrity. And so you wrote an autobiography for him.
I wrote 2 books with him.
2 books, okay. So Gifted Hands would be the one.
It's the autobiography. And it was made into a film. Sony Pictures made it as a TV film, which has done extremely well.
Mm-hmm. And so...
And then I did a follow-up book called Think Big, which is more of a motivational book.
Mm-hmm.
But I will tell you this, of all the people I've worked with, I don't think I've admired anybody as much as Ben Carson. He knew who he was, he knew what he wanted to accomplish. I don't know if you know his story, but he grew up in the ghetto of Detroit, and when he was in 5th grade, his mother found out he was failing everything. And she only had a 3rd grade education. She was one of 23 children. And she worked for rich people cleaning their houses, so she kind of knew how they lived. So she said to him, Benny, I want you and your older brother to go to the library every week, and you're going to check out 2 books. You're going to write a book report. And the dumb kid didn't know he could say no to Mama. And he also didn't know she couldn't read them. Mm-hmm. But he did it. And by the time he finished 5th grade, he was at the top of his class. And he kept going on. And by the time he finished high school, he won a full scholarship to Yale.
Isn't that just something? What a message, what a story.
Yeah. And one of the best, my favorite stories in the book is he was at Yale and he always wanted to be a doctor, go to medical school, but he had to pass chemistry. And he just couldn't get it. And he crammed and crammed and crammed, and he failed the midterm. He's a brilliant man, but he just couldn't get chemistry. So they had a rule that if you got a good grade on the retest, that would count as to your first. And he crammed and crammed, and he just couldn't get words. He just fell asleep one night, and crying out to God, help him. And he had this dream, and it's also in the film. In this dream, the professor came into the classroom, wrote the questions and answers on the board. And when Ben woke up, he remembered most of them, and so he hurriedly wrote them down to keep them in his head. And then when he went to class, it's exactly what the questions were. And he passed and was able to go into medicine.
Mm-hmm. Wow, you're talking about an answer to prayer.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And it's in the movie, which is really fascinating because they put it in there.
Well, and I realize presidents of the United States, I mean, a lot of times you think of people who've got some kind of a political, legal background, you know, that a lot of times they go into politics and eventually become our presidents. You know, sometimes war heroes have been our presidents.
Or actors.
And then I think of like actors, but here you have a physician. You know, but you got people, well, you have ministers who, you know, have at least run for president. Right. You know, but here you have a physician. What?
Well, Ron Paul's a physician too, you know.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so that calling, that sense of wanting to lead people and.
Well, let me tell you, I haven't talked to Ben in years, so. But in 2013, he was at the Presidential Prayer Breakfast, mm-hmm. and he made the statement that the healthcare system in this country is the best. Like, nobody knew that. I mean, of course, we all knew that. But because of that, the Republicans really started getting behind him and started pushing him to become more political. And he's so admired in the Baltimore area. Those folks just gave him the impetus. And next thing I know, Bill was running for president. So.
Yeah, isn't that something? So it's just that passion to say, well, if you really want to get something done, you know, this is how I'm going to have to do it at this point, is I got to run myself. It's one of those, you know, maybe it's one of those things where if I'm waiting around for somebody else to do it, I'm going to be waiting around a long time, so sometimes you just have to go out and do it yourself then, right?
There's one thing I like about Ben, and this is why I really wish he's been able to stay in the race. He's a man who understands consensus, mm-hmm. so that when he was working in Johns Hopkins and he had a whole team, he was able to make sure everybody was on board and they all worked out all their differences, and then they worked together. And not everybody can do that.
Yeah. So you've written for a lot of very famous people with inspirational stories. Yeah, but I don't know, what have you been kind of writing about lately? I mean, as far as, do you kind of have you know, maybe something that you've been kind of writing about lately that, you know, that people should know about?
Well, let me tell you, first of all, I just have this openness to the underdog. I like underdog stories. I kind of think of myself as an underdog. Last year I did a book called Stolen, the True Story of a Sex Trafficking Survivor. This woman at age 12 was recruited into sex trafficking in Florida. A long story, but she became a believer and finally walked out of sex trafficking. She had quit school, she took her GED, went to college, got an undergraduate degree, got a master's degree, and in 2015 she got her doctoral degree, and she's working with all kinds of survivor networks in South Florida.
Yeah, so that's quite an underdog story, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things of going from being let out of the whole bondage of sexual abuse kinds of things, all the way to having her doctorate, isn't that?
And you know, they hooked her on heroin. That's how they kept her going.
Okay.
And when God set her free, which they tell me it's almost impossible, she just walked away from it. And she said, I'm through.
But these are the stories that we inspire us
For sure.
and encourage us, that, whether it's somebody who's in a similar situation as she is in, or just an inspirational story to say that, there's hope for everybody. I mean, that's why I guess we all read, one of the reasons why we read these books is because it gives us all that sense of inspiration and hope and what God can be doing through each one of us and through all of us.
Yeah, and I haven't officially signed the contract, but I think it's okay to talk about it. I've agreed to write a book for a woman named Mariam Ibrahim from Sudan. She was in the news quite a while back. See, because Christians are being killed all over the world, her story is really a good focus for people to understand this. She came from a Muslim background. She became a believer. She married a believer, and they tried to make her return to Islam, and she said, "No, I am Christian," and refused. So they beat her with 100 lashes. I can't even imagine that. Put her in prison, shackled her feet. When she was pregnant, she had to give birth with her feet shackled, and then they sentenced her to death. I don't know how she got out, except that the British government intervened and anyway got out. She's now living in the U.S. She's in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and Tyndale House, through them, they contacted me, and I agreed to write the book. So I think it helps to show a spotlight on what's going on in the rest of the world. We don't understand how the radical Muslims, they're killing Christians everywhere.
Yeah, what a story. Yeah, so you are just kind of in the early stages of this whole thing, getting a contract.
I have a literary agent, and she has now an agent. So, and they've gotten their agreement. So now we're actually finalizing the contract. So probably we'll start working on it within the next month.
And so the whole process of writing a book like 90 Minutes in Heaven, or as you're embarking on a new project here, is there a kind of a timeline for all of this, or how long does it generally take?
I have 3 gifts from God when it comes to my writing. I'm fast, I have a lot of energy, and a lot of self-discipline. Mm-hmm. Now, those sound like kind of small things, but not many writers can sit at their computer 8, 10, 12 hours a day, and I can, and I do. And I write very, very fast. I type rapidly, not always accurately, but very accurately. So I've done this enough now that I read everything I can about the person before I meet them. So I know kind of what the story is, and then I let them talk. And then I work on the thing. It'll take me maybe 4 to 6 weeks, 6 weeks usually, to kind of get a story in a rough draft, send it to them, because I always misunderstand things or don't get things right. Tell them to check it. So I can now do a book in 3 to 4 months. Because I do things quickly. And that's one of the reasons why publishers like me, is because I work fast.
Yeah. Sometimes it can be where we can get stalled in our writing, things like that, but to be able to just be that diligent.
Yeah, and I have a literary agent. She said most of her clients take an average of 7 to 9 months to write a book.
Okay. So
that's the difference. And these are professionals. We're just all different, but I do things quickly.
Well, it sounds like it. It sounds like you're almost able to do it in half the time of what other professionals generally
I think
take.
something like that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, how about, here again, you've written a lot of interesting stories, or written books, I should say, about very interesting people is what I wanted to say. But how about, you've done some writing with, for instance, some end-of-life issues, and I'm not talking about the death experiences, but...
What I've done is I was contacted by Harvest House, it's a Christian publisher, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and they asked me if I would do some gift books for them. And I said, I'd be glad to if you can let me design my own books. So, for instance, I did one called When Some You Love Has Cancer. My wife died 3 years ago, but back 1999, she had breast cancer, high risk, and God really took her through it. We didn't know she would survive. Anyway, so I can talk and give all those kinds of stories, and at the end of the book, I give some specific things you could do, what you can do when you first hear someone has cancer, what you can do before you talk to them, what you can do while they're going through treatment and so on. So it's a practical book, and yet it's a gift book. Another one is, the one that's selling the best is called When Someone You Love No Longer Remembers. It's not just Alzheimer's, any form of dementia. I've got 2 or 3 on death and loss. One is How to Say Goodbye to a Loved One. Another one is called Because You Care. It's about long-term caregiving. So those are the kind of things that are close to my heart.
Yeah, so, and these are big issues today. Right. And it's on the minds of a lot of people, and a lot of people are just, because these are difficult things.
Yeah, and Mary Potter Kenyon, who's from Cedar Rapids area, she and I are going to be doing a couple of grief seminars. She lost her husband 4 years ago. I lost my wife 3 years ago, and we've become friends. And so we're trying to help people work through their grief, and help people work through their grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you do the seminars as well then?
Well, this will be 2 that we've never done them together before, but that's why I came to Iowa, to work with Mary.
Yeah, and so, well, anyway, this is Cecil Murphey, otherwise known as Cease, and he's written 137 books, primarily as a writer who writes autobiographies for people. And one, for instance, that has been very popular is 90 Minutes in Heaven. I know that you can get, his books that he's written, probably on most online bookstores, but also, well, a lot of your bookstores, such as probably Barnes and Nobles and Books A Million, or what bookstores all
any
over.
Christian bookstore, they all have them.
I go into these bookstores and I'll see copies of this book and so many of your books in there. And so, well, I tell you, just thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. You are a very interesting man, a very blessed man, gifted by God, and God as sure has used you as an instrument of His work, and what an inspiration. And so, and I want to thank all of you for joining us this day as well.
Thanks.